The bedroom door exploded inward so violently that it slammed against the wall before General Richard Prescott could even open his eyes. For one confused second, he thought the British camp had come under attack. Then he saw them. Muskets. Dark silhouettes. Mud-soaked boots. Not British redcoats. American Continentals. One of them stepped straight to the bed and leveled his weapon at Prescott's chest. "Don't move, General." Outside, everything remained silent. No alarms. No cannon fire. No shouting sentries. Only the sound of Prescott's own breathing as he realized the impossible had already happened. Somehow, in the middle of occupied Rhode Island, the enemy had walked into his bedroom. Within minutes, one of the British Army's senior generals would be marched barefoot through the darkness toward a waiting boat. Before sunrise, he would disappear across Narragansett Bay without a single British soldier firing a shot to stop it. 40 Americans had just humiliated the most powerful empire on Earth. But to understand how one of the boldest raids of the American Revolution became possible, you have to go back to the summer of 1777, when the British believed Newport was one of the safest places in North America. After capturing Newport in December 1776, British commanders transformed Aquidneck Island into one of their strongest positions in the colonies. The harbor was naturally protected. Royal Navy warships controlled the surrounding waters, batteries overlooked the main approaches, infantry camps covered the roads leading inland, patrol boats moved through the bay after dark, while pickets guarded the shoreline. Any force attempting a conventional assault would have to cross open water under the guns of the fleet before fighting through layers of seasoned British regulars. It was exactly the kind of position the British Army preferred. Strong, predictable, secure. Major General Richard Prescott had every reason to feel comfortable there. A veteran officer with decades of service, Prescott had fought in Europe long before the American colonies erupted into rebellion. He had commanded British forces during the occupation of Rhode Island and carried the confidence common among many professional officers of the Crown. The Continental Army had surprised British commanders before, but not here. Not on an island protected by ships, tides, and hundreds of disciplined soldiers. His headquarters reflected that confidence. Instead of living inside a heavily fortified encampment, Prescott occupied a substantial farmhouse near Newport, known today as the Overing House. Guards stood outside. Patrols moved through the area. Nearby British units could respond quickly to any disturbance. Everything about the arrangement suggested safety. But safety often creates its own weakness. Across the water, American officers watched the British position with growing frustration. Rhode Island remained firmly in enemy hands. The Royal Navy continued using Newport as an important base, threatening American shipping throughout New England. Launching a major assault was impossible. Washington's army lacked the men, artillery, and naval support needed to retake the island. Yet doing nothing allowed the British to strengthen their grip every passing week. Some officers accepted that reality. One man refused to. Lieutenant Colonel William Barton was not a famous general. He had never commanded a massive army or won a celebrated battlefield victory. Before the Revolution, he had been a farmer and militia officer from Rhode Island. He knew the local coastline better than most British officers ever could. More importantly, he understood something many commanders overlooked. The strongest fortress in the world is only as secure as the habits of the people living inside it. Barton listened carefully to reports from local patriots, fishermen, escaped prisoners, and civilians still moving between occupied and American-controlled territory. The information repeated the same pattern. General Prescott rarely expected danger after dark. His guards were competent, but not unusually alert. The roads between his headquarters and the shoreline were quieter than they should have been. Most important of all, the British believed the bay itself was their greatest protection. That assumption fascinated Barton. Because if everyone is watching the roads, no one is watching the impossible route. Instead of asking how to defeat thousands of British soldiers, Barton asked a far smaller question. What if 40 determined men never had to fight them at all? What if they only needed to steal one man and vanish before the British even realized he was gone? Most officers dismissed the idea immediately. Cross nearly 5 miles of open water at night. Slip between Royal Navy patrols. Land on occupied territory. March to the home of a British general, kidnap him, then escape the same way. It sounded less like a military operation than the plot of an adventure novel. But Barton kept refining the plan. He studied the tides. He measured rowing times. He identified isolated landing points. He questioned local guides who knew every fence, orchard, and narrow lane on Aquidneck Island. Slowly, an impossible idea began turning into a practical operation. There was only one problem. To succeed, every man involved would have to accept something before they ever stepped into the boats. If a single sentry raised the alarm, if a single musket fired too early, if a single British patrol blocked the road, none of them would ever see home again. And despite knowing that, 40 volunteers stepped forward, 40 men. That was all William Barton asked for. Not hundreds, not an entire regiment. Just 40 volunteers willing to row into the heart of British-controlled territory, capture one of the king's generals, and somehow bring him back alive. There was no promise of glory, no guarantee of survival. Most of the men who stepped forward understood they might simply disappear into Narragansett Bay, their bodies never recovered. Barton understood it too. Unlike many daring plans remembered by history, this one left almost no room for improvisation. Every stage depended on perfect timing. Every mistake would multiply the next. The first challenge wasn't reaching General Prescott. It was reaching the island. Between the American shoreline and occupied Newport stretched nearly 5 miles of open water. During daylight, the crossing would have been impossible. British warships dominated the bay, while armed tenders and patrol craft regularly moved between anchorages. Even at night, sentries watched for smugglers, privateers, and surprise attacks. One careless splash of an oar, one lantern reflecting across the water, one challenge from a British patrol boat. The mission would end before it even began. Barton refused to rely on luck. Instead, he relied on preparation. The volunteers gathered quietly at Warwick Neck, north of the main British positions. Local Patriot supporters secured several long whaleboats, fast, narrow craft designed for speed rather than comfort. Unlike heavier transport boats, they sat low in the water and could be rowed almost silently by experienced hands. Every unnecessary piece of equipment stayed behind. No artillery, no wagons, no baggage. Each man carried only what he might need if everything went wrong. A musket, a bayonet, a small supply of ammunition. Many also carried clubs or short weapons better suited for fighting in the darkness without firing a shot. Because Barton issued one instruction above all others: silence. No musket was to be fired unless there was absolutely no alternative. Gunfire would not simply alert Prescott's guards. It could awaken thousands of British soldiers across Newport. That order changed everything. The mission would not be won by superior firepower. It would be won by remaining invisible. As evening approached on July 9, 1777, the men waited for darkness to spread across the bay. The hours passed slowly. Some checked their weapons again and again. Others sat quietly, saying almost nothing. Few had ever participated in an operation remotely like this. Crossing enemy lines was dangerous enough. Crossing an entire bay, walking into the headquarters of a British general, and attempting to kidnap him bordered on madness. Yet Barton appeared remarkably calm. He had spent days collecting intelligence from Rhode Island residents still slipping between occupied territory and the mainland. Fishermen described currents that shifted with the tide. Local farmers pointed out neglected lanes hidden behind stone walls. Sympathetic civilians identified where British patrols usually lingered and where they usually didn't. None of the information was dramatic by itself. Together, it became a map of British routine. And routine was exactly what Barton intended to exploit. Shortly after sunset, the boats finally pushed away from the shoreline. The only sounds were the quiet splash of oars entering the water and the faint creak of wooden hulls. Ahead lay darkness. Somewhere beyond it stood dozens of British warships. The farther they rowed, the more isolated they became. Behind them, the American shore slowly disappeared. Ahead, scattered lights from Newport flickered across the black water. Every man understood the same terrifying reality. If they were discovered now, there would be no retreat. Royal Navy boats were faster. British reinforcements were closer. Even swimming ashore offered little hope in the cold currents of Narragansett Bay. For nearly an hour, the boats continued forward. Then one of the rowers froze. Off the starboard side, a lantern moved slowly across the water. A patrol. The Americans immediately stopped rowing. No one spoke. The boats drifted silently with the tide as every eye remained fixed on the approaching light. For several endless moments, it seemed certain the British vessel was turning directly toward them. One challenge, one shouted question. That was all it would take. The lantern grew brighter. Then, without warning, it began moving away. The patrol altered course. No alarm sounded. Only after the light disappeared into the darkness did Barton quietly motion for the oars to move again. The closest call of the night had ended without a single word being spoken. But the truly dangerous part of the mission had not even begun. At last, the Americans reached the western shore of Aquidneck Island. The boat slid onto the beach with barely a sound. 40 men stepped onto enemy territory. Behind them lay their only escape. Ahead stood nearly 6,000 British and Hessian troops. And somewhere in the darkness, less than 4 miles away, General Richard Prescott was already asleep. The moment the last boat touched the shore, Barton ordered the men to pull them farther onto the beach and conceal them among the rocks and brush. Those boats were more than transportation. They were the only path home. If British patrols discovered or destroyed them, the raid would end with 40 trapped Americans deep inside enemy territory. No one remained behind to guard them. There simply weren't enough men. Every volunteer had a role to play. Within minutes, the small force formed into a single column and disappeared into the darkness. The march toward General Prescott's headquarters had begun. The route had been chosen with extraordinary care. Rather than following the main roads connecting British camps around Newport, Barton led his men along narrow country lanes bordered by stone walls, orchards, and open farmland. During daylight, these roads carried wagons, livestock, and supply carts. At night, they became almost deserted. The only sounds came from boots pressing into damp earth, the occasional chirp of insects, and the distant surf rolling against the shoreline. The silence itself became unnerving. Every few hundred yards, the column halted. Scouts slipped ahead. They listened, watched, then quietly waved the others forward. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the metallic parts of muskets had been wrapped with cloth before the mission to prevent accidental noise. Bayonets were secured tightly, canteens were carried carefully to avoid a single clink that might carry through the still summer air. Everything depended on remaining ghosts. The farther they advanced inland, the more dangerous every step became. British detachments occupied farmhouses across the island. Mounted patrols occasionally rode between outposts. Entire regiments camped only a short distance away. The Americans could not fight through even a fraction of those forces. Their greatest protection was not strength. It was surprise. Nearly 2 miles into the march, the column suddenly stopped. A rider, somewhere ahead. The faint rhythm of hooves drifted through the darkness. Barton immediately motioned the men off the road. Within seconds, 40 soldiers melted behind stone fences, trees, and hedgerows. No one moved. The horse passed slowly along the lane. Its rider never suspected that dozens of armed Americans were lying only yards away. Moments later, both disappeared into the night. Only after the sound had completely faded did Barton signal the advance once again. The danger had been avoided. But each close call reminded the volunteers how little separated success from disaster. Around midnight, the Americans reached a point where local intelligence became essential. The countryside near Prescott's residence was unfamiliar to most of the raiding party. In darkness, even a wrong turn could waste precious minutes or lead them directly into British lines. Fortunately, Barton expected exactly that problem. Before the operation, Patriot supporters had identified a local resident who knew every road surrounding the general's headquarters. The man was expected to guide them through the final approach. Instead, they found someone else. Moving cautiously along the road was a local farmer named Nathaniel Potter. The Americans surrounded him before he could react. For a brief moment, Potter believed British soldiers had captured him. Only after Barton quietly identified himself did the frightened Rhode Islander realize he was standing among American troops. His surprise quickly turned into disbelief. When Barton explained their objective, Potter reportedly stared at him in silence. Capture General Prescott? Tonight? The idea sounded impossible. Yet the armed men standing around him made it clear they were entirely serious. Without hesitation, Potter agreed to help. His knowledge of the area proved invaluable. Leading the Americans away from the more heavily traveled roads, he guided them through fields, narrow lanes, and small paths that curved toward Prescott's headquarters, while avoiding places where British sentries were most likely to appear. The closer they came, the greater the tension became. Lights appeared through the trees. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. At one point, the group froze as voices drifted across the night from what sounded like a nearby British outpost. The conversation lasted only moments before fading away. No alarm followed. The Americans continued. Then, through gaps between the trees, they finally saw it. A large farmhouse standing quietly beneath the summer sky. General Richard Prescott's headquarters. No walls. No fortress. No rows of defensive earthworks. Just a comfortable country house surrounded by outbuildings, gardens, and a handful of guards who believed they were protecting one of the safest officers in the British Army. Barton stopped the column. For the first time since leaving the boats, every volunteer gathered close enough to hear him without raising his voice. The plan was simple. A small assault group would rush directly into the house. Others would secure the entrances. Another team would prevent anyone outside from escaping to raise the alarm. Everything had to happen at once. No hesitation. No confusion. No unnecessary violence. The objective was not to kill General Prescott. It was to take him alive. Barton looked around at the faces illuminated only by faint moonlight. Hours of preparation. Miles of silent marching. And every impossible risk they had already survived. Now came the one moment that would decide whether history remembered them as heroes, or as 40 missing soldiers who vanished somewhere in the Rhode Island darkness. The farmhouse stood in complete silence. From a distance, nothing suggested that one of Britain's highest-ranking officers was sleeping inside. No shouting guards. No patrols circling the grounds. No visible signs that the headquarters of Major General Richard Prescott was expecting even the slightest threat. That illusion was exactly what Barton had counted on. He quietly divided his force into smaller groups. A handful of men would surround the house and prevent anyone from escaping. Another group would secure the nearby road. The rest would storm the building itself. Each volunteer already knew his assignment. There would be no time to issue orders once the attack began. Barton raised his hand. The men moved. They crossed the final stretch of open ground at a quick but controlled pace, spreading into position around the farmhouse. Every heartbeat seemed louder than their footsteps. Then everything stopped. A sentry. One British guard stood near the entrance, his musket resting casually against his shoulder. He had no reason to believe danger was approaching. The island was filled with British soldiers. Royal Navy ships guarded the surrounding waters. Who would be foolish enough to attack the general's residence? That confidence lasted only a few seconds. Several Americans rushed forward before the guard could fully understand what he was seeing. He attempted to raise his musket. Too late. He was overwhelmed before he could fire a shot. The struggle was brief, violent, and almost completely silent. Within moments, the sentry had been disarmed and restrained. No alarm spread across the countryside. The mission remained alive. Barton immediately pushed toward the front door. According to later accounts, it was locked. There was no time to search for another entrance. No time for caution. The Americans smashed their way inside. The crash echoed through the farmhouse. For the first time that night, silence gave way to chaos. Servants awoke in confusion. Voices called out from upstairs. Doors flew open as startled occupants tried to understand what was happening. Some believed robbers had entered the house. Others assumed drunken soldiers had started a fight. Almost no one imagined that American troops had somehow crossed the bay. Barton ignored the confusion. He already knew where he was going. Local intelligence had identified Prescott's bedroom on the upper floor. The assault party raced up the staircase before anyone could organize resistance. At the top, another obstacle appeared. A household servant stepped into the hallway, terrified by the noise, trying to block the strangers from advancing. The Americans brushed past him. Seconds mattered now. Every delay increased the chance that nearby British troops would hear the commotion. Then Barton reached the bedroom door. He didn't knock. He drove it open with force. The door slammed against the wall. Inside, General Richard Prescott awoke to a scene that made no sense. Only moments earlier, he had gone to sleep believing himself protected by thousands of British soldiers. Now armed Americans filled his bedroom. For an instant, Prescott simply stared. Accounts differ slightly on the exact exchange, but they agree on one essential fact. The general was completely stunned. Barton immediately leveled his weapon. "General Prescott, you are my prisoner." The words carried extraordinary weight, not because of the number of men in the room, because of what they represented. An American officer had just informed a British major general that he had been captured in the middle of his own occupied headquarters. Prescott looked around, trying to understand how such a thing could even be possible. Where were his guards? Where were the patrols? How had the enemy crossed an entire bay without being detected? None of those questions mattered anymore. The raid had moved too quickly. Resistance was pointless. Still wearing only his night clothes, Prescott asked for permission to dress. Barton agreed, but only under close watch. Several Americans remained inside the room with muskets trained on the general, while others searched the house for additional officers or armed resistance. Every passing second increased the danger. The crash of the broken door, the frightened voices downstairs, the movement inside the house. Sooner or later, someone would reach the nearest British outpost. Sooner or later, cavalry would begin searching every road leading away from Newport. The Americans had accomplished the impossible. But the most dangerous part of the mission was only beginning. Capturing General Prescott had taken just a matter of minutes. Getting him off the island alive would prove even harder than breaking into his bedroom. General Richard Prescott finished dressing under the watchful eyes of armed Continental soldiers. No one spoke more than necessary. Every second inside the farmhouse increased the odds that someone outside had already realized something was terribly wrong. Barton refused to waste another moment. Move. The Americans hurried Prescott downstairs, surrounding him on every side. There was no need to tie his hands. 40 loaded muskets made resistance pointless. As they reached the ground floor, frightened servants and members of the household watched in disbelief. The commander of British forces on Rhode Island, walking out his own front door, escorted by American soldiers. It was a sight few would have believed possible. Outside, the remaining raiders reported that the grounds were still quiet. No organized response, no approaching patrols, no alarm bells. Their extraordinary luck was holding. But Barton knew luck had an expiration date. The column immediately turned away from the house and began the march back toward the western shore. This time, however, they carried something far more difficult than weapons. They carried a prisoner whose disappearance would throw the entire British garrison into chaos the moment it was discovered. Prescott remained remarkably composed. He asked Barton several questions during the march, still trying to understand how the Americans had managed to reach him. How many men were involved? Had another American force landed elsewhere? Was Newport under attack? Barton offered almost nothing. The fewer answers Prescott received, the longer British commanders would remain confused after his disappearance. That confusion was now becoming one of the Americans' greatest advantages. Behind them, the farmhouse slowly disappeared into the darkness. At first, nothing happened. The roads remained empty. The fields stayed silent. For nearly a mile, the raid seemed almost unreal. Then the first distant shouts echoed across the countryside. Someone had finally discovered the empty bedroom. Lanterns began appearing behind them. A dog barked, then another. Within minutes, isolated voices multiplied into organized activity. British officers were waking their men. Messengers raced toward nearby camps. Orders spread through the darkness. General Prescott was gone. At first, many officers reportedly refused to believe the reports. Kidnapped? From inside occupied Newport? Impossible. Some assumed he had simply moved headquarters during the night. Others suspected drunken confusion among the guards. Only after multiple witnesses confirmed the same unbelievable story did the truth become unavoidable. The commanding general had vanished. By then, Barton and his men already had a valuable head start. Still, the danger was far from over. The Americans moved quickly but carefully, forcing themselves not to break into a reckless run. A panicked column made noise. Noise attracted attention. Instead, Barton maintained discipline. Scouts continued checking the road ahead. The main body protected Prescott in the center. The rear guard watched constantly for pursuit. Then came another tense moment. In the distance, horsemen. Whether they were British patrols or local civilians, no one could immediately tell. Barton reacted instantly. The Americans left the road and concealed themselves behind stone walls lining a nearby field, pulling Prescott down with them. The riders passed without stopping. Their silhouettes disappeared into the darkness. Only then did the column resume its march. Every close escape reinforced the same truth. They had not defeated the British Army. They were simply staying one step ahead of it. At last, after hours that seemed to last an entire lifetime, the smell of salt water returned. The shoreline emerged from the darkness. Their boats were exactly where they had left them. No British patrol had found them. It was the final piece of good fortune they desperately needed. Without hesitation, the volunteers pushed the whaleboats back into Narragansett Bay. Prescott was placed aboard under heavy guard. The Americans climbed in after him. Oars dipped silently into the water once again. But this crossing would be far more dangerous than the first. Now the British knew something had happened. Signals were beginning to spread across Newport. Lanterns flashed from the shoreline. Officers searched desperately for any clue indicating where the kidnappers had gone. If Royal Navy patrol boats reached the bay before Barton crossed it, the escape could end in disaster. The volunteers rowed with everything they had left. Exhaustion burned through their arms. Hours of tension, marching, and fighting weighed heavily on every man. Yet no one slowed down. Behind them, the lights of occupied Newport grew brighter as more British soldiers rushed toward the waterfront. Some officers believed the kidnappers must still be somewhere on the island. Others argued they could not possibly have escaped the harbor. That disagreement cost precious time. By the time British commanders understood the Americans had likely returned to the bay, Barton was already disappearing into the darkness. The most daring kidnapping of the American Revolution was only minutes away from becoming a complete success. But its greatest consequence had nothing to do with embarrassment. The man sitting silently in Barton's boat was about to become one of the most valuable bargaining chips of the entire war. The first hint that they had survived came with the changing current. As the whaleboats pulled farther from Aquidneck Island, the sounds of Newport slowly faded behind them. The shouting became distant. The lanterns along the shoreline grew smaller. Even so, no one relaxed. Not Barton, not the exhausted rowers, and certainly not General Richard Prescott. The British commander sat in the middle of the boat, surrounded by armed Continentals, staring back toward the island where thousands of his own soldiers were desperately searching for him. It was a surreal sight. Only a few hours earlier, he had gone to bed believing himself untouchable. Now, every stroke of the oars carried him farther away from British control. The crossing remained dangerous. British patrol boats could still appear without warning, and dawn was drawing closer with every passing minute. Once daylight broke, the Americans would lose the darkness that had protected them throughout the operation. The men rowed harder. Their shoulders burned. Hands blistered against the oars. Many had now been awake for nearly an entire day, yet no one asked to rest. Failure was still only one mistake away. Fortunately for Barton, confusion continued to work in his favor. British officers spent precious time trying to understand what had happened before deciding how to respond. Some believed Prescott had been murdered. Others insisted he was hiding somewhere nearby after escaping an attempted assassination. Several commanders assumed the kidnapping was merely a diversion before a larger continental assault on Newport. That uncertainty delayed any coordinated pursuit. Instead of immediately sealing every possible escape route, British units searched roads, fields, and nearby farms across the island. The Americans were already beyond their reach. As dawn approached, the familiar outline of the mainland finally appeared through the morning haze. The volunteers had done it. Against every reasonable expectation, 40 American soldiers had crossed one of the most heavily defended bays in the colonies, entered occupied territory, captured a British major general from his own bedroom, and returned alive. When the boats reached the American shore, word spread almost immediately. Soldiers rushed to the landing site. Local militia gathered in disbelief. Officers who had expected to hear only rumors suddenly found themselves looking directly at General Richard Prescott. The reaction bordered on astonishment. Even among Continental officers, few had believed Barton's proposal could actually succeed. Now the impossible was standing before them in person. Prescott was treated as a prisoner of war rather than a criminal. Although firmly guarded, he was not abused or publicly humiliated. This reflected an important difference between 18th century warfare and many later conflicts. Senior officers were considered valuable prisoners, often exchanged rather than imprisoned indefinitely. Barton understood that from the beginning. His objective had never been revenge. It had been leverage. News of the raid spread through the colonies with remarkable speed. American newspapers celebrated the operation as proof that British power was far less invincible than many civilians believed. At a time when the Revolution desperately needed victories that inspired confidence, Barton's raid became exactly that. Not because thousands of enemy soldiers had been defeated, but because British prestige had suffered a devastating blow. Imagine being a loyalist living in Rhode Island. The British Army claimed it controlled the island completely. Royal Navy ships guarded the harbor. Thousands of professional soldiers occupied the roads. And yet, 40 Americans had quietly entered, seized the commanding general, and disappeared before anyone could stop them. If the British could not protect one of their highest-ranking officers, how secure was their occupation really? The humiliation reached London as well. Military defeats could sometimes be explained. This was different. It exposed complacency. British commanders throughout North America quietly reviewed the security surrounding senior officers. Guards became more vigilant, headquarters were relocated, night patrols increased around important installations. One daring raid forced an empire to rethink its own confidence. For William Barton, recognition came quickly. The Continental Congress formally honored him for the exploit, recognizing that he had accomplished something few officers in the war could claim. He had defeated the enemy without fighting a battle, without artillery, without cavalry, without firing the kind of volleys that usually defined 18th century warfare. He had won through intelligence, secrecy, timing, and absolute discipline. But the greatest reward had not yet arrived. General Prescott was now one of the most valuable prisoners held by the Americans. And thousands of miles away, another captured general was waiting for exactly the kind of bargaining chip the Continental Army had desperately needed. His name was Charles Lee. For nearly 6 months, one of George Washington's most senior commanders had remained in British hands. Now, for the first time, the Americans possessed someone important enough to bring him home. For months, Major General Charles Lee had been one of the most important prisoners held by the British. Captured in December 1776 after becoming separated from the Continental Army in New Jersey, Lee's loss had been a serious blow to George Washington. Though his relationship with Washington was often strained, Lee remained one of the highest-ranking officers in the American cause. The British understood his value and had little incentive to release him without receiving something equally important in return. Until William Barton crossed Narragansett Bay, the Americans had almost nothing to offer. Now they did. General Richard Prescott, one of the British Army's senior commanders, captured alive. The contrast could not have been greater. Lee had been taken after being surprised while staying miles away from his own troops. Prescott had been captured from the center of what was supposed to be one of the safest British positions in North America. Both cases reminded commanders on each side of the same uncomfortable truth. Rank offered prestige. It did not guarantee safety. Negotiations over prisoner exchanges moved slowly, as they often did during the Revolutionary War. Military leaders argued over terms, political leaders weighed the consequences, and neither side wanted to appear weak. Eventually, however, Prescott's value proved impossible to ignore. In 1778, he was formally exchanged for Charles Lee. One daring nighttime raid involving just 40 volunteers had succeeded in returning one of Washington's senior generals to the Continental Army. That alone would have secured Barton's place in American military history. But the raid's significance extended far beyond the prisoner exchange. Military historians still study the operation because it demonstrated principles that remain relevant centuries later. First, intelligence outweighed numbers. Barton never attempted to overpower the British garrison. Against nearly 6,000 British and Hessian troops, that would have been impossible. Instead, he gathered information patiently, identified weaknesses, and built an operation around precise knowledge rather than brute force. Second, surprise multiplied combat power. 40 disciplined men achieved what thousands attacking head-on almost certainly could not. The British were not defeated because they lacked soldiers. They were defeated because they never realized they were under attack until it was already over. Third, leadership mattered at every level. The mission depended on every volunteer maintaining discipline, despite exhaustion, fear, and constant uncertainty. No one fired prematurely. No one abandoned the plan after the first close call. From the silent crossing to the withdrawal with Prescott, success depended on dozens of small decisions executed almost perfectly. Remove just one of those decisions. A noisy landing. A missed turn. A sentry firing his musket. A delayed retreat. And history might never have remembered William Barton at all. The British also learned valuable lessons. After Prescott's capture, security procedures surrounding senior officers became noticeably stricter. Headquarters were more carefully selected. Guards became more alert. Commanders grew less willing to assume that distance, geography, or naval superiority alone could guarantee their safety. The psychological impact was enormous. The raid shattered an illusion. Until that night, many British officers believed occupied Rhode Island was effectively untouchable. Barton's success proved that determined opponents could exploit even the smallest cracks in an apparently perfect defense. More than 2 centuries later, the operation still stands as one of the most audacious special missions of the American Revolution. It featured no massive battlefield, no famous cavalry charge, no dramatic exchange of artillery. Instead, it was a carefully planned strike carried out in darkness by ordinary men who trusted preparation more than luck. William Barton never commanded one of the Revolution's largest armies. His name rarely appears alongside Washington, Greene, or Lafayette in popular history. Yet, on a single July night in 1777, he accomplished something those celebrated commanders never did. He walked into occupied British territory, entered the bedroom of a British major general, captured him without firing a battle, and rowed him safely back across a bay guarded by the Royal Navy. Sometimes history changes because of great armies. Sometimes it changes because 40 determined volunteers refuse to believe that impossible is a military fact. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more forgotten operations, impossible missions, and extraordinary moments from military history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us what you think made Barton's raid succeed. Was it British overconfidence, Barton's meticulous planning, or the discipline of the 40 volunteers who carried out one of the boldest kidnappings in military history? Because on that quiet summer night in Rhode Island, an empire learned a lesson it would never forget. The strongest fortress is often defeated long before the first shot is fired.